from about 2004 right up to today, if you look at any book that has the name Harriet Tubman, any serious scholarly written book, you'll see Dr. Larson. Dr. Larson was gracious enough to help us when we were doing the research, Kent and I, concerning facts and figures about Harriet Tubman. And it was Dr. Larson who was the first to give us the true relationship between Harriet Tubman and Keziah Bowley. And as you probably know, if you've been reading the papers or some of our literature or promotion, Bowley was a hero in Georgetown. So I am so happy and so honored that Dr. Larson came all the way from the state of Massachusetts to help us kick off this Bowley Tubman weekend celebration. Dr. Kate.
Thank you for inviting me. This is so exciting. I can't believe I'm here. I can't believe what you all have done to unearth this story of James Bowley and celebrate him here. It is just pure joy for me. And I know Tubman would be completely overwhelmed with pride that her nephew made such a difference here. So this morning I'm going to tell you a little bit about Harriet Tubman. Her story is pretty well known. And to talk about James Bowley and where he comes from, who his people are in Maryland, just to sort of anchor him so that he appears here full grown as a man ready to take on important work, but he came from someplace. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that place, the landscapes, and his family. I'm just overwhelmed. Steve just gave me this book. I hope you all get a copy. I can't believe this. It's about Tubman and James Bowley, and it's in English and Gullah. So everybody get a copy and go out on the internet and through social media spread the word. Okay, so Tubman, my most favorite person in the whole world. Needless to say, I have been researching her life for more than 25 years. And she was the topic of my dissertation at the University of New Hampshire. And my book, Bound for the Promised Land, was published in early 2004. And I have been researching her life every single day since I was working on the dissertation. And I've been very much involved in the 2 national parks that are now dedicated in her honor, one in Maryland and one in Auburn, New York, where she spent the last 50 years of her life. And we have Harriet Tubman Byway in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. And hopefully that byway will go all the way to Canada. And now you all are creating this story here, and I just hope it blossoms and creates more and more interest in Tubman and her family, because family is all what Tubman was concerned about. That drove her to do things every single day was love of her family. Anyway, so Tubman and the Bowleys come from Dorchester County and the eastern shore of Maryland. And their story spans 2 counties, Dorchester and Caroline County, and the Choptank River. And so that's the region, we call it the Choptank River region. Their ancestors were brought from Africa. We're not entirely sure, we're pretty sure they were Ashanti, but we're not entirely sure because those records of enslaved people sold off of ships in the Chesapeake, we don't have a record of that. We just have the records beyond that time. Anyway, so this is the eastern shore of Maryland, and I want to tell you that the eastern shore of Maryland is just like here. You could be plopped right down in Dorchester County and think you are here in Georgetown County, South Carolina. The landscapes are very similar. Marshes, rivers, streams, forests, agricultural fields. It's the same thing. This is what Tubman grew up with. This is where James Bowley was born, and though he left when he was 6 years old, this was the environment that his parents grew up in and he would have known as a small boy. So when Tubman was here and when Bowley was here, these were familiar landscapes. And so this is actually a photograph of Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Dorchester County. These are landscapes Tubman and her family and the Bowleys would have traversed, but I could have taken that picture, I think, nearby. So Tubman was born in a place called Peter's Neck in south of Madison in Dorchester County. But as a small child, she was brought to Bucktown, which is the place that most people who are familiar with her story connect her to. But the family was at great risk of being sold constantly because once the cotton fields and these rice fields and other agricultural lands opened up in the south and southwest, slaves from the Chesapeake were sold to supply the labor for these deeper south states. And between 1790 and 1860, over 1 million people were sold, enslaved people were sold from the Chesapeake to the Deep South. So many people in the Deep South have their roots in the Chesapeake. So Tubman's family was no different. They were at risk. She ended up having 3 sisters sold away from the family, which tore that family apart. In fact, Dempsey P. Kane, here's an advertisement that he put in the local newspaper. One of Tubman's sisters, Mariah Reedy, was sold to Dempsey P. Kane in 1825. We tried to trace what happened to her, but we're not really sure. He purchased quite a few people, so we're not sure if he sold her along the way or took her all the way to Mississippi, but we're not sure. There's a famous story of Tubman being injured at the Bucktown Village store. If any of you go to Maryland, you can follow the Harriet Tubman byway to the sites of her life, including the Bucktown store. And this is the event where she was about 13 years old, and she was breaking flax in the barnyard, and the dust and all sorts of particles from the flax came up in her hair and made her hair very messy. And the cook came to her and said, you know, Minty, she was born Araminta, called Minty as a child, you need to come to the store with me to buy some goods for the kitchen. And Tubman didn't want to go. She was 13 years old and her hair was messy. And but the cook forced her, so she grabbed a shawl from the kitchen and wrapped her hair in the shawl, and that shawl and her hair, she said, saved her life that day. When she arrived at that store, an overseer had chased a young man who had fled his work assignment in the field, and they had run into the store as Tubman was arriving to the store, and the overseer yelled to her to stop the young man from running, and she stepped aside instead of stopping him. And the overseer picked up a weight from the scales on the dry goods store counter, and he threw it, intending to hit the young man, but Tubman had moved back into the entryway, and that weight slammed right into her head and broke her skull and knocked her out. She later said that they carried her back to the plantation she had been hired out to the Thomas Barnett plantation, which was about a mile from the Bucktown store, and they laid her out on the seat of the loom in that kitchen. And it's like a piano bench for those of you who have never seen a large loom. And they left her there for a day and a half with no medical care. And they woke her up and said, get back into the fields. And she talked about all the blood and the sweat and that tremendous pain from her wound working in the fields until she collapsed unconscious. It took her mother several months to bring her back to better health. But she suffered from epileptic seizures for the rest of her life because of that serious wound. But this was a defining moment for Tubman. She was a teenager, and religion was very important to her at the time, but once she had this head injury and she began to have seizures, they were accompanied with lots of oral seizures and visual sort of hallucinations, and she believed that God was speaking to her directly. And she would pass out on the ground, but she would have visions of the future. She would hear angels, what she thought were angels singing. She would float above the earth and look down at everybody scurrying around her. But she always felt the presence of God, and she felt that God was protecting her, and later she felt that He was guiding her. So this was a seminal moment, a horrific event, but at the same time it reinforced the spiritual being that she had and her belief in a spiritual world that was protecting her and guiding her. So she grew up to be extremely strong and healthy. Even though she was 5 feet tall and suffered with these epileptic seizures, she was still incredibly strong and determined and persistent. So after she healed, she was hired out to a place called Madison, which was then called Tobacco Stick, and it was on the wharves. The slavers that she was hired to, the Stewart family, owned warehouses, shipyards, and fields where she worked. And she became so strong that she was the marvel of people on the docks. At 5 feet tall, she could haul barrels of goods on and off these ships. So you can imagine this little petite, tough little woman just, you know, wowing everybody. She also was in an environment that witnessed a lot of escapes. So in Dorchester County, we've documented that hundreds of people fled along the villages and wharves and communities along the Choptank River between, say, 1820 and 1860. In Bucktown, where Tubman spent portions of her childhood, maybe 10 or maybe 12 people fled in that 40-year period from Bucktown. It was in the interior of the county. So being near water mattered, having access to vessels, access to black mariners who carried information from around the Chesapeake and the Atlantic seaboard. They could carry information about, and this is before Tubman's time, but the Haitian Revolution, for instance, or, you know, states in the north that were outlawing slavery. They could tell people who were on these docks in these communities about freedom in the north, where people could go, how they could get there, who to trust and who not to trust. So Tubman's relationship with these black mariners begins on those docks. Her father, Ben Ross, was a very highly respected enslaved man. He was a lumberjack and a timber inspector, and he was enslaved by Anthony Thompson, who owned 1,000 acres in Dorchester County. And much of it was timber. So Ben Ross became sort of the foreman, and he was noted for his skill in looking at a tree and knowing what would be good on that tree for different parts of a ship, not just the mast, but all sorts of parts of the ship. And trees in those regions, they were so old and so big, they would try to topple them over to get the roots as well and use the roots for parts of the ships. So he had this skill, and he was very well respected. In 1840, he was set free, and Tubman was able to hire herself out and work with her father in the forests and on the canals and on the docks. So through her relationship with her father, she was able to learn survival skills in the woods and continue those relationships with black men who worked in the forest and on the water, because that would become really important when she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. I put this reward notice here just to give you an example. This is Nellie Keene and her husband, Joe, and they had 8 children, and they escaped in April of 1832. And I love this story. This is very close to Tobacco Stick. This is near where Tubman was first born, and then later when she came back as a teenager and young adult to work in the forest. And Nellie was pregnant. They had all these children. Joe put them in a little sailboat and sailed them away to freedom. And I found some of their children in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1840s. So I know that the enslaver, Levin Wolford, never captured them. And I just love this story because it represents part of that maritime network. Joe was able to, he was a sailor, and he probably sailed, you know, goods for his enslaver to different places, but he had those connections. The Chesapeake and Delaware Canal had just been built. He probably sailed through that and found his way to freedom with all of his children and his wife. It's a very unusual escape. Generally, families did not flee together. It was incredibly difficult to take children and flee with them, but this family did, and it turned out to be a success. So these escapes are happening where Tubman lived, so she knew the possibilities. Also, on the Eastern Shore in Dorchester County, the population in that county was half black and half white, and half the black population was free and half was enslaved. So freedom was there around her. Most families had free and enslaved people. They were by the 1830s and 1840s. Most black families were blended. And so there was that sense and that freedom just beyond her grasp. In 1844, she married a free man, John Tubman. He was freeborn of freeborn parents. So people talk about, or have in the past talked about how Harriet Tubman was forced to marry John Tubman. Of course, that makes no sense because John Tubman was free. He could marry anybody he wanted to. And he must have loved her deeply because he chose to marry an enslaved woman. He had to have loved her because that meant that any children they had would have been born enslaved. He would have no rights to her because she was enslaved by Edward Brodess and no rights to their children. So it's just, we need to acknowledge that love and the importance of that relationship. Later, he didn't follow her to the north and he married somebody else, but in the beginning they loved each other, and we should acknowledge that. But that represents the reality in Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore. Blended, free, and enslaved families. The Bowleys. So the Bowley family, James's grandparents, were enslaved, and great-grandparents were enslaved by the Stewart family, Levin Stewart, who was a shipbuilder and prominent man in Dorchester County. He also moved to Washington, D.C. He had a shipbuilding enterprise there on the Potomac. But he left all of his enslaved people back in Dorchester County when he left about 1820. But in 1817, he manumitted all of his enslaved people, including the Bowleys, Dick and Bina Bowley. And those were James's grandparents. And he set up a schedule where they would be manumitted at dates way into the future. So Dick and Bina were manumitted, so they were set free in 1828. So the grandparents were Dick and Bina Bowley, and their children were Major, Richard or Dick, he was called Dick, Harriet, Terry, and Simon. Those were James Bowley's uncles and his father John. And over on the other side, so this is the Manumission Document. It's one of many Manumission documents that Levin Stewart executed in the courthouse in Dorchester County. And there were many of them because he kept changing his mind and reducing the schedule, the amount of years that they had to perform their labor and stay enslaved. So he also, once each more children were born, he would go back and manumit them when they were like 30 or 35 years old in the future. The other one is for Dick Bowley, and this is James Bowley's uncle. And Dick was, originally enslaved by Levin Stewart, but when Levin died, James Stewart, the son, inherited Dick. And he was a very trusted enslaved man. We have documents where James Stewart would send Dick with money to a store to purchase items or to go to auctions and bid on things for James Stewart. And so Dick was very, very much trusted. Well, one day, apparently, Dick went to visit his wife and didn't come back when he was supposed to. So James Stewart issued this reward notice for the return of Dick. Well, apparently Dick really did not escape. He was visiting his wife, and maybe he was mad at James Stewart for something, and he didn't come back, or he wanted to be with his wife and children, so he stayed away too long. He came back, and it was a very public thing, and James Stewart forgave him, and Dick was manumitted the following year, so he became a free man. All of the Bowley boys, James Bowley's uncles and his father John and Dick and the others, were trained as ship carpenters, blacksmiths, and they were very, very accomplished men. So when they were set free, the brothers actually opened up their own shipyard and started building ships in Dorchester County. So they were very well accomplished and very well admired men. So this is what James Bowley comes from. So on September 17th, 1849, Harriet Tubman fled with her two brothers, Ben and Henry. This is the advertisement for her capture, and we know from Tubman's own testimony that she fled with her brothers, and they stayed away about 2 or 3 weeks, and they were confused about which way to go and who to trust, so they came back. And so this advertisement is from Eliza Ann Brodess, the widow who inherited Harriet Tubman, her mother, all of her siblings. And she didn't know for 2 weeks that Harriet Tubman and her brothers had escaped, because Tubman and her brothers were working 40 miles away from Bucktown in a place called Poplar Neck in Caroline County. But nevertheless, they did come back, and then Tubman escaped on her own. But I want you to read this advertisement if you can. It says $300 reward, ran away from the subscriber on Monday the 17th, which meant September 17th. 3 Negroes named as follows. Harry, aged about 19 years, has on one side of his neck a wen just under the ear. He is of dark chestnut color and about 5'8" or 9 inches height. Ben, aged about 25 years, is very quick to speak when spoken to. He is of chestnut color, about 6 feet high. Minty, aged about 27 years, is of chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 feet high. $100 reward will be given for each of the above named Negroes if taken out of the state, and $50 if taken in the state. And they must be lodged in Baltimore Eastern or Cambridge jail. So there's Eliza Ann Brodess' advertisement. Most of the ads are like this. They give tremendous information about the appearance and the slaveholders' perception of those runaways' attitudes, like, you know, they're smart alecky or whatever. They always had these things to say about them. So they came back on their own, so she didn't have to pay a slave catcher any of the reward money, which was good because she was deeply in debt, and she needed to sell these enslaved people. In fact, on September 17th, Keziah Jolly Bowley, James Bowley's mother, was about to be sold at an auction on the courthouse steps this very day that Tubman and her brothers made their attempt to freedom. Tubman decided later, maybe a couple weeks later, to flee on her own because she knew she was going to be sold. Eliza Brodess needed money and needed it fast, and selling enslaved people was the quickest way to get cash. So she sang a goodbye song to her mother and her family members in Caroline County and near the quarters that they were living in, and she fled. She went to a Quaker woman who lived nearby. We're not sure of the woman's name, but there were only 2 Quaker women that lived nearby, Hannah Leverton and Hester Kelly, so it must have been one of those women. And one of those women had said to Tubman at some point, if you need help running away, just let me know. So Tubman went to her, and the woman told her to sweep the front yard, to act like she was being hired, and then to wait for the man of the house to come home, and he would put Tubman in a wagon and take her to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. And eventually, she made it to Philadelphia. But when she reached there and she was free, she said it felt like heaven, but it was terrible because she couldn't fully feel free because her family was still enslaved. And she was determined to go back and rescue them. Now, enslaved people who ran away had these regrets and they missed their families. It was always a Sophie's choice to decide to leave because you were leaving everyone you loved behind. For some people, or many people, they fled because they were going to be sold. And so sailed to the Deep South, and the average lifespan of a Chesapeake enslaved person sold to the Deep South was 7 years. So they knew that it was a death sentence for them. So they chose to try to flee and take their chances. But Tubman is a little bit different. Some enslaved people returned to rescue family members, but she returned many times, 13 times we've been able to document. I just am throwing this in here about the Underground Railroad. There were many, many routes. There wasn't one. There were no quilts. There were no lawn jockeys. There were no any of that stuff. It was people usually finding their way to freedom on their own and trusting that blackjacks or black mariners would help them, and other people along the way would look the other way or deliberately help them. The Underground Railroad in the South is much more difficult to document because it did have to be kept secret. In the North, we can document it. People were very proud being part of the Underground Railroad. You know, they talked about it all the time. But in the South, it's mostly enslaved people who are part of the network to help others get to freedom. Those enslaved people decided to stay behind because they could and they wanted to be with their families and they were not at risk. So we need to acknowledge the enslaved community, not just white Quakers or abolitionists, but it was enslaved and free blacks who were the foundation of the Underground Railroad. So these are the routes. People went into the Caribbean, they went to Mexico, and up into Canada and to the West to find freedom. And there were many ways to access, people ran or walked, they rode on horses, they went on ships, in wagons, hidden under vegetables, or in false bottoms built into wagons. We have several documented wagons that were built for this purpose, and they traveled on trains after 1830. So this is the advertisement that is in the local newspaper, Cambridge, Dorchester County, Maryland newspaper for Keziah's auction. On that 1849, 2 weeks before Tubman and her brothers fled. So the auction was postponed from the 10th of September to the 17th of September, and then it was canceled again. Because we believe that Keziah's husband, John Bowley, who was free at this point, he and his brothers, we believe were trying to raise the money to purchase Keziah's freedom, along with their two children, James Alfred Bowley and little baby Araminta. So we believe that John Bowley went to Eliza Brodess and the administrator of Edward Brodess's will, John Mills, and argued for postponing the auction until he could raise the money. We know that John Bowley's brother, Major, sold his interests in a ship to raise money, and he went to Baltimore and tried to raise more money. So with those actions, we do believe they were trying to raise the funds to purchase Keziah. So Tubman has fled, and she learns that in the fall or in December of 1850, Keziah is going to be auctioned again. Obviously, John Bowley wasn't able to raise enough money for Keziah and the two children. It would have been several $100s to purchase them. And so Tubman made arrangements through John Bowley. We believe it was through these maritime connections, getting messages back and forth, where John would go and bid on his wife at the auction. Let me see if I have this. Well, here's a letter that James Bowley wrote to his aunt in 1868 that describes part of this story. But we know the story of what happened to Keziah on the auction block because it's in the courthouse records in Dorchester County. The auction starts. John Bowley is there in the crowd of white faces, bidding on his wife and his children. He keeps bidding and bidding. He wins the auction. The auctioneer, for some strange reason, did not call for payment. He went to lunch. John Bowley takes his wife and the two children, and they hide in a white woman's house in Cambridge. James says 5 minutes from the courthouse. They wait till nighttime. He puts them on a boat and he sails them to Baltimore, to the waterfront, where Tubman is waiting for them, along with other former Dorchester County free people who are working in the shipyards at Fells Point in Baltimore. And one of those men was Tom Tubman, Harriet's brother-in-law, and then Major Bowley, John's brother, is still there as well. They secret them in the waterfront in someone's home for a few days. Tubman convinces a white man in Baltimore to put up a $500 bond to bring Keziah to Philadelphia. Black people could not leave the state unless there was a bond testifying that they were not actually enslaved. So even John Bowley needed some money for a bond to be able to travel out of the state. So did Tubman. Tubman actually had forged documents from Philadelphia, but they needed someone to vouch for Keziah. So Tubman lied to this white guy and said that Keziah and the children were free. John Bowley was free. He was easily convinced. So he posted a bond, and Tubman was able to bring them to Philadelphia. So this letter, it's a lousy copy. I took a picture of this back in 2001, so today digital is much better than it used to be. But this is owned by the Harriet Tubman home in Auburn, New York, and they have it in a safe deposit box. And eventually when that park is up and running with a new visitor center, they will have it on display. And we'll talk about this in a little bit. So the Baltimore waterfront was a vital source of support for freedom seekers. There were women that worked in the markets along the waterfront. They would pass messages back and forth. They would pass forged documents, seaman protection papers, like Frederick Douglass had forged papers that he used. So these market women were an important part of that underground story. So Tubman brings the family to Philadelphia, and the Fugitive Slave Act has passed in 1850, and it's too dangerous for them to stay in Philadelphia because slave catchers are everywhere now. Philadelphia had the largest free black and fugitive black population in the country at the time. So slave catchers were there looking to snatch anybody off the street, so it was too dangerous. So the Bowleys, Keziah and John, and baby Araminta went on to Canada, while Tubman kept James in Philadelphia and boarded him in a school so he could be educated. And for Tubman, this was really, really important. She was denied that type of education. She could not read or write letters. And we always like to talk about Tubman had tremendous literacy. She was a genius. She definitely was a genius. But her literacy was being able to read the landscape, to read the night sky, to read the clouds and the fields, and to read the landscape of people, because that was her survival, to be able to read that white person over there, what was that person going to do, her slaveholders, the people she was hired out to, and to read that landscape. So she was brilliant. So her literacy was different and valuable and important. It kept her alive. But she wanted James to have letters, to be able to read and write. So she imbued that into him. His family ended up in Chatham, on the western part of, southwestern part of Ontario, way down here across from Detroit. And John Bowley was a blacksmith there, and they settled in a fugitive community there, and they stayed till after the Civil War. And they had several more children. And James had several siblings, Araminta, who I've already mentioned, Hosea, Harkless, John, Pleasant Ann, Lina, and Anna. And Lina is named after Keziah's mother, Lina Ross, who was Harriet Tubman's sister. And Lina was sold away from the family in the 1830s, and she left behind Keziah, and Keziah had a sister named Harriet, who eventually was sold to Texas. And I'm trying to work with some people in Texas to try to trace her family, if she had children, are there descendants of Harriet Jolly back there. And Keziah's father was Harkless Jolly, an enslaved man, and so it's Keziah Jolly Bowley. So they settled in Chatham and thrived. And this is a picture of a black community in the Chatham area. I just put in there so you'd see this community there. So after Tubman rescued Keziah Jolly Bowley and the two children, James and Araminta, she was determined, based on that success, that she would return to rescue the rest of her family and her friends, the people that she loved. And over the next 10 years, she returned about 13 times and rescued 70 family or friends. Tubman actually said that she went back 8 or 9 times and rescued 50 or 60 people. but we've been able to document a little bit more than that. And she also gave instructions to other people in the community in Dorchester and Caroline County who used her instructions, her connections on the Underground Railroad to liberate themselves. And they all ended up, most of them, in St. Catharines, across the Niagara River, in Canada. And they recreated their community that they had in Dorchester County. They just replicated that familial and social community there. So this is actually a clip from the film that we just premiered at the Harriett Tubman Visitor Center in Dorchester County. We have an orientational film to the Visitor Center. It's about 16 minutes long, and this is one of the scenes with Tubman leading people away. And they just posted this video online. You can just search Harriett Tubman Visitor Center Soldier of Freedom, and it will come up on YouTube. She relied on a tremendous network of supporters. In our visitor center, we have an interactive where you can see all these supporters, and there were 50 of them, and we had to stop at 50 because the software couldn't take anymore, and actually, unfortunately, it keeps crashing every time we play with it. There are just so many names. I mean, we probably could double or triple that. And this is before social media or telephones or any of that. She connected with so many people. And they were so overwhelmed by her personality, her courage, her faith, her brilliance, that they basically would do anything for her. And that's what she required. She knew what she was doing was very risky, and it required putting her life at risk, and it required tremendous courage. But it also required a lot of financial, emotional, and physical support. And she demanded that these abolitionists, who were up in the north and very comfortable, stand up and do something more than just write articles in the newspaper or hold meetings. She really pushed them, and some of them felt that call to be more activist-oriented, to be more radical. And we have, for those of you who are doubters, there's so much documentation about Harriet Tubman, which we did not know existed, but now we know, and it keeps showing up every year. We find more and more documentation. This is an Underground Railroad journal by Sidney Howard Gaye, who kept a record that survived. It's for 1855, 1856. Tubman would go through his office in New York City with freedom seekers, and one day she came through and he sat down and he wrote 5 pages about her in his journal. All the other names have a paragraph, but she's got 5 pages. He called her Captain Harriet Tubman. She just wowed everybody. She was unbelievable. She just wouldn't stop. She persisted. And there were other journals. William Still had a journal. There were many abolitionists who wrote about her in their letters and diaries that we're still unearthing. There was one that came up last year. Jermaine Logan was a minister in Syracuse, New York, who ran an Underground Railroad station, and he knew Tubman. And he had a daughter named Tinny. She went on to become a doctor. And her daughter gave testimony later on that her mother was influenced, even as a little girl, to become a doctor because of Harriet Tubman. Because once Tubman came through their house with a freedom seeker who had buckshot in their legs. And she watched as Tubman took the buckshot out, and Tinny was asked to help soothe their wounds, and that inspired her to become a doctor. I just think that's the most amazing story. Tubman did everything. So, of course, you know, in the Civil War, she was sent by Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts to come to South Carolina, to Port Royal in the Hilton Head District, because he admired her so much, and he knew that her skills could be put to use by the United States Army. And so she came down here, and her skills were put to good use. She was a spy and a scout. She led the raid up the Combahee River in June of 1863, where they routed out rebel forces. They burned down plantations, and I was just reading yesterday in prep for this lecture some of the testimony by the slaveholders, the plantation owners on that river whose plantations were burned down. And one of them said, "I swear I saw a woman on the bow of that boat." Yes, there was a woman on the bow of the boat. So, and they liberated about 750 people. And this was, this is Tubman's goal. She fought slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland every day in a very personal way, and she carried and waged that war during the Civil War. She continued her battle against slavery there. This is a picture of her pistol and a saber that a family owns in Florida, and it's on display at Florida State University. And this, of course, is a woodcut of Tubman in her Civil War uniform. By the way, so we had, when we were working on the visitor center in Maryland, we sent this photograph to Gettysburg, and they have these experts in Civil War firearms. And they came back and they were stunned because this rifle is a specific, specially made sharpshooter's rifle. And they said, this says a lot about Harriet Tubman that she had that gun. Of course she had that gun. Seriously. So she was a nurse, and she talked about nursing the wounded. And she witnessed the Battle of Fort Wagner, which I didn't know that you can't go there, like they don't have public transportation there, so someday I'm coming back and I want to go there and just on that hallowed ground, so one of these days. But I just want to read to you what Tubman said about that battle. This is in an interview later in her life. She said, "And then we saw the lightning, and that was the big guns. And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was the dead that we reaped." Isn't that powerful? She was lyrical in the way she described things. She worked in the hospital to nurse wounded soldiers. She nursed, actually, Charles Smith of the Massachusetts 54th. He went on to become a minister, and he ended up assigned to her church in Auburn, New York, the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church, so they were reunited. And he left testimony about her nursing the wounded there. But she also talked about being a nurse and what challenges they had. So she said, "I'd go to the hospital early every morning. I'd get a big chunk of ice and put it in a basin and fill it with water. Then I'd take a sponge and begin. First man I'd come to, I'd thrash away the flies, and they'd rise like bees around a hive. Then I'd begin to bathe their wounds, and by the time I bathed off 3 or 4, the fire and heat would have melted the ice and made the water warm, and would it be as red as clear blood. Then I'd go get more ice, and by the time I got to the next ones, the flies would be round the first ones, black and thick as ever." Isn't that incredible? She was unbelievable. So she had open access to Union officers. She could go to their tents, talk to them anytime. She was so widely admired and respected. Can you imagine this 5-foot-tall, formerly enslaved woman, conversing with Union generals who just were like listening to her and admiring her? And James Montgomery, who was the colonel who led the 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers, and he went on the raid with Tubman. He admired her so much, and she admired him because he was great friends with the famous John Brown. And Tubman really loved James Montgomery because he was radical like John Brown was. She liked men of action. Forget the ceremony and all that stuff. Do it. Just do what you need to do and end slavery. So they were like two peas in a pod. Colonel Higginson, a New Englander, he was the captain of the 1st South Carolina Colored Volunteers. And he didn't like James Montgomery and also that Tubman was working with him, even though he admired Tubman. But he thought they were too much of like bushwhackers, that they were, they were not being gentlemanly, actually. That's what he was complaining about. But Tubman didn't care. There was a job to be done, and it meant slavery had to be ended. So she was a soldier, she was a spy and a scout. And tragically, she should have been paid. She petitioned the government to pay her as a spy and a scout. She submitted a bill for $966 for her service. They had already paid her $200 while she was completing her service. She used that to build a cookhouse and a wash house so that newly freed women could run a business to wash the clothes for Union officers and to cook food and earn money, because enslaved women there had not earned money. So she deducted the $200 and said, "You owe me $766. The government would not pay her. And it wasn't because she was a black woman, it was because she was a woman. Because she was the leader of 8 Black Scouts. They got paid and she didn't. Yeah. So within that time period of the Combahee River Raid and the assault on Fort Wagner, James Bowley, 19 years old, joined the United States Navy to come and fight in the Civil War. He served on the Genesee for about 18 months, and then he ended up coming to South Carolina after the war to continue his work in trying to overcome the legacy of slavery. I haven't done that much research on the Genesee, the boat. Maybe you have, Kent. Yeah. It would be nice to know where he was, where the Genesee saw action. But I know that Tubman must have been incredibly proud of him, and he was, going to fight just like she was. So he became a teacher for the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau has records of paying him to be a teacher down here in Georgetown, and it was his passion. He knew that education was his liberation, along with the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, but education was the key to a future and to success. And so this was his passion. He wanted to provide this for people here in South Carolina. And it is interesting why he chose here, but I think it might be found somewhere in his service records, or he may have asked the Freedmen's Bureau where was the greatest need, and he had no qualms about going anywhere. A lot of formerly enslaved people went to Maryland and Virginia, close to northern states, but he came down here and did that. So there's a story there, and I encourage anyone who has time to start researching that. And of course, he was elected to the South Carolina State Legislature. This is from the first legislature. His picture is not here, but this is from the first one. I think this is 1866 photograph. This is 66.
So he, one of the legislatures in this picture died during his term, and Foley was elected to replace him mid-term. So that's why he didn't make the picture here.
Okay, all right, so. That's great. That's great. So, the confidence to just do that. Just, Harriet showed him the way. His father and mother showed him the way. He had that in him, and he acted on it. His siblings did not. His brother Harkless did. His brother Harkless became a teacher in Dorchester County, Maryland. And he went on to live in D.C. and things. But the other siblings did not do what James and Harkless did. And he became a trustee of the University of South Carolina in 1872 until the university shut down because they didn't want black people to be trustees of the university. So rather than, learn to get along, they shut it down. And then in 1873, he began publishing the Georgetown Planet, a black newspaper. And this is remarkable because there were so few black newspapers across the country. And so this literate man, he isn't stopping. He's like Tubman. He's persisting. He's going to find any way possible to promote and to engage and to provide resources for the community. And so this is what he is all about. And driving around this community, I'm just trying to imagine James here, and it's thrilling. It's really thrilling that he did this. And this, of course, is the house where the marker will be, right? I haven't been there yet.
It doesn't look like that anymore.
Oh, okay. Well, I can't wait to see it. And thank you to Marilyn and Kent and Steve. I mean, this is really, it's incredible what you have done here. It is remarkable. This should be happening everywhere. And the moment is now. This wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. I just feel that it wouldn't have. But it's the moment is now. These conversations are happening, and they're difficult conversations. There's a lot of resistance, but the time is now, and these are important. Our communities need to see these things, hear about them, celebrate them. I wish his family knew about this. We've got to find them. We've got to track them down. And these are the stories that our children across the country should be hearing about. And we're not hearing about them. We're not learning them in school. We're not hearing about them on the streets. There are too many other statues that need to come down, and there should be statues to Harriet Tubman and James Bowley and others instead. There, I said it. So James did the same thing that Tubman did, fighting for freedom, family, faith, and community. That's what Tubman was all about. Those struggles, everything was for her family. She was guided by her faith. She was sustained by her faith, her family, her community, and that freedom was just everything. And her strive for equality and justice and self-determination. She fought for the rest of her life as a suffragist and a civil rights activist. And those are things that we still need to fight for, and we need to use Harriet Tubman and James Bowley as the inspiration to continue those struggles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's give Dr. Larson one more hand. I told you she is a Tubman scholar. Do we have time for Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yes.
What made you, when you were studying and getting ready for your dissertation, what made you choose Harriet? How did you come about that?
So she asked how I came about doing my dissertation on Harriet Tubman. So it's the other way around. She found me, basically, and then I decided to go and get my PhD so I could do my dissertation on her. Back in 1993, I had young children, and I had my MBA, and I was working for an investment bank, and I just wasn't happy. It was a great job, great boss, but I just didn't like it anymore, and I always loved history, so I decided to go back to school and get a degree in women's history at Simmons College in Boston. And I had gotten my undergrad degree there in the late 70s, and one of the professors I had as an undergrad, Mark Solomon, was teaching a graduate course in African American history. And at the time, I wasn't even thinking about African American history, but I loved him so much I took the course. And in 2 weeks, I knew I wanted to study African American history. That it just hit me, that was it. I was going to do that along with women's history. At the very same time, my daughter was 7 years old in second grade, and she came home with a little biography of Harriet Tubman. And so we read it, and I was aware of Tubman, but for some reason, the syzygy of everything happened at once. I went to the library to find an adult biography, and there were 2 19th century biographies and one from 1943, and that was it. The rest were all juvenile fiction. So I went to Mark Solomon, my professor, and a couple other professors in the history department at Simmons, and I said, is this possible? And they're like, that can't be possible. She's so famous. Well, it was true. No one had done any work on her. So I finished my master's, and I was devoted to finding her story. And I went to the University of New Hampshire. I applied to many different graduate programs, but they all said that I couldn't do a biography of someone who did not read or write.
Oh.
Yeah. So, but I went to the University of New Hampshire, and they're like, oh yeah, you could do this. This is a great idea. Because there were Southern historians on the faculty there. Who knew? And they were like, you're going to find so much information you have no idea. So I started in New England, where all those abolitionists were, and they just were old Yankees. They never threw anything away, and all their letters and diaries are in archives up there, libraries, archives, whatever. And so I was reading their records, and she's popping up in their letters all the time, and they're like overwhelmed by her. They quote her all the time, and they're very emotionally involved in her life. Tubman had a sister, Rachel, that she kept returning to Dorchester County to rescue. And Rachel had 2 little children, and the Brodesses had separated Rachel from her children, and Rachel would not leave with Tubman unless Tubman could get the children at the same time. And Tubman wasn't able to do that. And then Rachel died. So So in the abolitionist letters up in the North in 1860, they're writing back and forth how awful it is, how tragic it is that Tubman's sister had died. They are so emotionally wrapped up in her life. And I thought, what is it about this woman? She's amazing. And then one of my professors at UNH, Jeff Bolster, who wrote the book Blackjacks about black maritime world, the Atlantic world, he said, you know, you've got to go down to the Chesapeake, you have to go to the Eastern Shore, you have to see the landscapes where she was enslaved. You have to feel it, you have to hear it, you have to smell it, you've got to see it. So I went down there, and that put the pieces together, because the courthouse had some records, many burned in the 1852, but many survived. And in the Maryland State Archives, there are all these records, and especially that court record about the testimony of Keziah's sale and how John had bid on her. And so the white people testifying are like, well, and then the next thing we know, you know, the auctioneer comes back and he's looking for payment. Yeah, wink, wink, I'm still not getting that. And so they decide to sell Keziah again, but she wasn't there, so they started selling her sight unseen. But they said the husband obviously, you know, took off with her, what a ruse and all that stuff. I think the auctioneer was in on it. He must have been paid. Tubman talked about how slaveholders and white people in the South could be paid to look the other way. I suspect he looked the other way. It doesn't seem right that he wouldn't take payment, especially from a black man. Yeah, I think he would have normally said, give me the money right now. Yeah, so I think it was a setup. So that's my story, yeah. And now I can't stop researching her life, because thank God for the internet and everybody's digitizing everything, so stuff comes up all the time. Any other questions?
How difficult was it before things were getting digitized to find all of these?
It was so hard, and if you've ever worked with those microfilm machines, they're blind, they're awful. Oh my God. Now you can just key in Tubman, and every newspaper before 1900 comes up with, you know, they just have the articles right there, but I had to go through microfilm. It was torture, torture. Although I still love going into the archives and pulling out those records, the papers from 1840 and 1850. And for those, I don't know what it's like in South Carolina. I don't know what was burned during the Civil War and what survived. But enslaved people were property, and they were well recorded. So it takes a long time, but their families can be traced. But it takes time, and you need to commit to it, to doing it. And I know in the Chesapeake, I have since been hired by the National Park Service to do a larger study about Dorchester County, where the national park is. And so I had the opportunity to go back to those slave ships and discovered that we can't link her specifically to her family to a ship, but we can link her to the next generation. So it is possible. So there are people who could trace their families to 1707 or 1695 in Dorchester County. So it is possible. It just is a lot of work. Yes?
Where's the most interesting place you've been to find research on Harriet Tubman? I'm not from South Carolina. I haven't been here that long. And I know I work for the federal government, and going down to the Combahee area or the Ace Basin, and there's a bridge named after Harriet Tubman. And I was just like, wow, I've never been anywhere, and there's like a bridge named after Harriet Tubman. It was so cool. So just like learning about this event and then coming here and listening to all this history is just like so eye-opening. But like it's just fascinating to know like the history in this area and like where it might be a spot that she's.
So I don't know about researching down here, because the work that I did on the Civil War, it was all Civil War documents, like, you know, letters that Union generals wrote mentioning her, or passes that they wrote for her, and testimony in letters from Union officers, like William Lloyd Garrison was a famous abolitionist. He had a son who was a lieutenant, and he was stationed on Foley Island. Is it Foley or Folly Island? Foley Island. And so he wrote home to his parents, Harriet Tubman's here. She's like a spy and a scout and a cook and a nurse, and wow, she's unbelievable. So I got information from that. And the Combahee raid was published in newspapers and in Union documents. So a lot of that stuff is now available online. But I don't know what like plantation documents are here. I don't know what survived. I don't know, like in the Chesapeake, people who owned enslaved people, they were taxed because it was property. So all those tax records, you can go to the tax records and you can find the names of people they were taxed for. So you can trace families through the tax records and through wills and a probate estate records and things like that. So, you know, right back to the earliest days. So I don't know what that is here in South Carolina, but I would imagine some of that is still available at a state archives or county, if the county courthouse wasn't burned. The colonial records are all preserved because those were generally, a lot of them were English and British, and I think you could find up until 1776 records. And there might be a gap, but you can find them. Well, thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Go to the South Carolina Historical Society.
Oh, okay.
And they also have books listing things like this.
Okay.
And actually, Patty Burns, our person here on in the adult reference staff, she actually has some materials. And
Great.
so please check with her.
Okay.
But the South Carolina Historical Society is a place to go. In Charleston. At the College of Charleston Library. That's all.
Thank you.